Welcome to the Agile on the Mind podcast, where we talk about building intelligent teams with the help of agility and cognitive science. I'm your host, Daniel Susser. If you enjoyed this episode, you'll probably enjoy being a subscriber to the Agile on the Mind Substack. Subscribers receive a free weekly email with a blog or podcast about intelligent teams and cognitive science. To subscribe, visit agileonthemind.substack.com. This week, I was delighted to welcome my first honest-to-God cognitive scientist onto the Agile on the Mind podcast, Professor Fred Cummins. Fred is an associate professor at the School of Computer Science and Informatics at University College Dublin, where he co-directs the postgraduate cognitive science programme. I encountered Fred through his excellent Introduction to Cognitive Science series, which are publicly available on YouTube. As you'll see in the episode, he's a vivid and enthusiastic communicator of cognitive science. Fred conducts interdisciplinary research into joint speaking, which is where two or more people say the same thing at the same time, as found in practices of protest and prayer. Joint speech raises theoretical issues that go into the heart of human experience, and we go into it into the episode. Fred is also drawn to the study of ritual, and I'm not going to lie, I was very much in annoying student mode throughout this episode, and whilst I tried to bring the conversation back to teams, there were extended periods where I was just thrilled to be having a conversation about cognitive science with a real-life cognitive scientist. Fred's insights, questions, metaphors and observations are mind-bending and deeply human, and it was a great privilege to share this conversation with him. So, I present this episode of Agile on the Mind with Professor Fred Cummins. Welcome, Fred, to the podcast.
Thanks. Thanks, Daniel, for having me.
What is cognitive science?
There are multiple views on that. I took over a program teaching it in 1999, and at the time it described itself as building computational models of mind. I had to get rid of that nonsense, and now I describe it as the maximally broad investigation into the relationships between the knower, the known, and the means of knowing, always with those three things. But that's my personal definition. It's inquiry into knowing. It's epistemology in a scientific register. Inquiry into our own being in a very important way, ranging all the way from technical models of control and behavior to inquiry into consciousness and very big questions. So it's not one thing. And anyone who claims that they're a cognitive scientist is suspect. That includes me.
What's suspect about claiming to be a cognitive scientist?
Well, how am I going to tell you what knowing is? I mean, you know perfectly well what knowing is. You're doing it right now. All I've got is words.
So there's something about what science is about, studying stuff that we can all look at and gather around and agree. But if I am interested in knowing, then I'm asking you questions about things that's quite hard for us to all look at because it's like the contents of your mind or the reality of your experience.
Yeah. We in a very glib fashion suited for the pub only, we can say science is X or science is Y. When you get to cognitive science, that becomes extremely problematic because science is not one thing. There used to be inquiry into things, natural philosophy. And then in the 19th century, lots of things happened. The science became professionalized and split into disciplines which now tend walled gardens, which develop technical vocabularies over a limited domain, but their vocabularies don't match, and so there's no big overall science picture. Science, which was inquiry into the natural, became technologized, and now it becomes just as much about producing new G-jaws and bombs, which that was not the original meaning of science. But science, probably more than half of science research is military funded and serves the purposes of war. So all of science has this problem. So that's why it's complicated to say science is X, Y, or Z. But most sciences understand themselves as working in an objective mode, which is a difficult term. It took me a long time to realize that was difficult. That wasn't a simple thing. Because if something is objective, in a way, that simplifies things, right? Here's a cup. You know it's a cup, I know it's a cup. We don't have any problems with it being a cup. Now, people can go off and write dissertations about the phenomenology of encountering the cup, but the cup is not troubled by this. We got a nice objective cup. Unfortunately, the things that we're asking after in cognitive science can't be put on the table like that. There are things that have to do with how you understand what's going on with you on ongoing basis, and how others view you, how you behave, how you're viewed and judged. And ultimately, at the bottom of it, cognitive science is interested in something that we associate much more with the word subject than object. Now, those words are, of course, complicated, but to cut through the Gordian knot, to simplify things here, Bruno Latour gave us a lovely definition of objectivity, which I wish was used more. He said objectivity is achieved when the objections are overcome. So, cup, we're happy, we got an objective cup. We can go and do our business. That doesn't mean ultimately real, and it's very important that that definition means the objections of a specific discourse community. So objectivity is constructed. This is a view a lot of scientists don't like, but we don't get around it in cognitive science. That's why cognitive science is interested in the construction of science itself. And one of the allied fields is science and technology studies, which studies the activities, objectivizing activities of science, because cognitive science is unfortunately lumped with a lot of linguistic confusion about subjects, objects, the real, external worlds, internal minds, all of these linguistic fictions. That's far too long an answer. Yes, science is great. But treating of science as if it were a single thing is difficult. But before I go any further, not to appear like a nihilist or an anarchist or something like this, scientific competence is developed in specific domains, and that's absolutely brilliant. Right? Not all the domains are warfare. Vaccines are a good idea, for example. It's very important to, when you realize what's happened in the history of science. That doesn't mean that any individual has given up searching for the truth or looking into things in the most general fashion. But what we meet in the professionalized, compartmentalized fields of science now are specific discipline-specific, domain-specific skills techniques. And that's a technical matter, and we need this in order to gain competence in certain areas. But we gain competence in areas without any easy way of spotting the consequences outside of those areas. So, for example, I could invent a better seal for a mechanical device. It seals better. That's technical competence. And one guy goes and uses it in a heart stent and does great surgery with it, and one guy puts it into a drone to kill people with in Azerbaijan. So my seal contributed to both activities. That's what I mean by this locality now of competence.
And it's one of the questions I was going to ask, which I think you've now sort of superseded, was like cognitive science is this interdisciplinary approach. And it's something that I like about cognitive science is it says if you want to study mind or intelligence, you can't just do that from one discipline. You can't just do that from looking at the wet stuff of neuroscience or looking at the dry stuff of psychology or of philosophy. You need to, each of these will have a contributing role. And I was going to ask, why is it that mind lends itself to a multidisciplinary approach? And why is it that it brings science together? But it sounds like from what you just said, it's more like science has fractured itself into these different walled gardens, and cognitive science, in asking such big questions like about mind and being and consciousness and intelligence and all these difficult things, has to bring the disciplines together and has to sort of ignore or supersede or overcome the fragmentation of scientific disciplines.
It's not going to do that. I wish it could. It has to deal with this. It has to live with this ambiguity and tension. What becomes increasingly clear, at least from my perspective, is that there's a certain epistemological tension that we're not going to get rid of. Basically, we have, in our inquiry into ourselves, we are aspirational and we have very fond dreams of ourselves. Words like intelligence speak to that. All the human exceptionalist construction of ourselves, everything that puts us as beyond or distinct from the beasts, so, the brute beasts and the animals. That's our aspirational axis, and we're stuck with it, even though it leads us into entirely narcissistic, self-constructed images that have no contact with reality. But in a more grounded sense, when we recognize our finitude, since about 1850, the middle of the 19th century is important here. Again, Darwin told us you're not accepted from the natural order. You have to understand yourself as, if you're going to use the category animal, then you're going to have to be an animal among animals. If you're going to use the category organism, you're going to have to understand what that means to see yourself as an organism. And those biologically informed views of our being don't meet up with the aspirational ones: rationalism, truth, intelligence. They don't meet up, and they never will. And that's where we live.
So we have these ideas, we have these broad, big things like intelligence. And when I say something like, what is intelligence? Am I really just asking, what is there that is like the things that I like about my own mind? As in, like, I think of myself as intelligent in ways X, Y, and Z. I'm really good at maths, and I like to play chess, and I'm really good in a crowd. So therefore, that's intelligence. Let's look at a study of that. Whereas those definitions, that's not a useful definition, and like actually, that's just narcissistic in taking a quality about myself and saying, this is what exists out there in the universe.
Wouldn't it be a horrible thing if someone sat around and said, I'm going to introduce a practical test that's going to be used to gatekeep institutions, divide up resources, admit some people into elite, and keep others out. And how I'm going to make up this test, I have no idea what it is, but I'm going to make sure that the people that do well on the test are a lot like me, or a lot like my ideal person, probably my daddy. That would be a dreadful thing, and that's exactly what happens with IQ tests, of course. Intelligence is a fabricated notion. It belongs squarely to our aspirational being. As I said, you're never going to get rid of this idea. Any positive definition of intelligence is laughable, absolutely laughable. And the contemporary discourse around artificial intelligence, I hope we don't have to go there today in this podcast. Maybe we will. But the word intelligence, I mean, there's nothing more artificial than artificial intelligence. I believe, though, we have a good model for intelligence if we'd only recognize it.
Which is?
Because we look at each other and we go, oh, Daniel, you're brilliant. Intelligence must be something like us, right? Let's stop the narcissism and include a lot of people. And we start going around and you go, oh, you're brilliant. We want to develop some metric or some way of constructing intelligence that makes us all look good, right? And then we're going to find that we're racists, that we're going to find we're sexist, we're going to find we're xenophobes, we're going to find we don't understand other people, and we're still only building a small little clique. So can we do better than that? Yeah, we can. And we've already found the most alien intelligence we encounter is the most interesting because it's the one that's least subject to narcissistic portraiture. And that's the octopus. The octopus is the one animal that everyone has to agree is bloody intelligent, though we've no idea what it means. Its form of living is utterly alien to us. We don't have to look for alien life on Mars. That's stupid stuff. We found the most intelligent, most distant thing we can contemplate is the octopus.
In the opinion there that you sort of shot down was, we could extend our definition of intelligence. It's not like me, but it's like all of us, people like me, or it's more all of us humans. And that becomes a kind of narcissism. But then you could extend out and go, well, it's like us mammals, or it's like us this, or it's like us octopuses. Well, why not say, it's also like us paramecia, right? Like a paramecium that can do what it needs to do to survive in its own environment. That has a kind of simple intelligence. And, adding formal logic to a paramecium doesn't make it more intelligent because it's not relevant to its context. And then intelligence becomes less about like a quality of an organism and more about a relationship between an organism and its environment.
Right, you switched registers there. You switched into a 4E mode where we consider mind as a property of life, and we're willing to extend it to willy-nilly to all kinds of life, no matter how alien. But notice intelligence went away there. It wasn't intelligence we were talking about anymore. I was talking about intelligence as the fetishization of the white man, let's put it like that. The fetishization of the white man who can reach truth from his armchair. And he should be looking at the octopus. Those of us who are in the mind and life community are not so precious about things, and we're just as interested in parameciums as we are in humans. But you appealed to a larger we called the humans, and no one's ever managed to construct that properly in a way that included anything like a substantial number of the people I recognize as my kind. Humanism is dangerous if it's assumed to be a closed or like as a relational category. When we address each other in the vocative, it's our basic ethical ground. As a constructed category with borders, it's terrible because no one's ever done it without excluding nearly everybody.
So when I say, oh, this is what humans are like, what I'm really thinking about is, like, am I thinking about distant, unfamiliar cultures to me with languages that aren't constructed like mine and models of the world? There was interesting, I've been listening to your graduate introduction to cognitive science series on YouTube, and there's a point you make, I'll see if I can get it right, which is, I listened to it yesterday, so this will be a good revision for me in front of teacher, which was, there was a debate between Chomsky and the MIT group and a linguist that went off into the Amazon in Brazil, who went to go and ended up converting him, and he said, look, Chomsky and for those that don't know, Noam Chomsky is a famous seminal linguist who's still kicking around, I think, and who came up with a view that is all humans have languages or have language making abilities of certain properties. And then this, what was the name of the chap who went off to Brazil?
Daniel Everett went off to study the Piraha tribe in Brazil. It's the Piraha really we're talking about. They are people who live in the Amazon, and their language doesn't fit Mr. Chomsky's presuppositions. And so Mr. Chomsky and his bunch of Boston linguists, who I have a strong beef with, painted themselves into the ridiculous position of either declaring this tribe of savages that they don't know to be inhuman or giving up on their theory. And if there's one thing the white man won't do, it's give up on his theory. And the academic battles that ensued were some of the ugliest I've ever seen.
The accusations are, you don't think these people are human, and
the form of argumentation, the slander, the slurs, there was no substance to the debate anymore. It just became an epidemic. What's that sport where they just go into a ring and kick the shit out of each other? UFC, yeah. So it became academic UFC. Not good.
Some people might pay a lot of money for that, but yeah.
Maybe we should go into business, Daniel.
Yeah, interesting. It is born AUFC. So people listening to this might wonder, this is a podcast that's supposed to be about teams and how I make intelligent teams and how this might help me back at work. And so I'm thinking, part of just before we started recording, we said part of the role here is I'll ask Fred questions about cognitive science, and then I'll try and maybe zoom out and ground it, what this could mean for us as teams. And I like the phrase intelligent for teams because it's so loose and poorly defined. But also we kind of do have a sense of when we think we're looking at it or not. And when people who are thinking about how to make their teams high performing, they'll often look at another team elsewhere and go, oh, great. The software team at Spotify was a great structure for how to organize agile teams. We should do that. It sort of projects an intelligence onto that, and it forgets that the thing that I'm bringing it back to may not be relevant to it. Or we go, oh, Toyota in the 70s, they were a brilliant team. They were so good. And you think, well, they had a kind of intelligence, like a fittedness to what they're trying to do, or they were good at solving a certain set of problems. But then, are they good at solving my kind of problems? To some extent, yes. No. Maybe there's something.
I see nothing wrong with using the word intelligence like that. It just means I kind of admire it and kind of think I would like to do something like that, and maybe I'll discover problems down the road. Not all. You see, when we talk, we're much more reasonable than when we write. People think the reason is in the writing, but the writing is where things become dogmatic and definitions get made. But I use the word intelligence. We use these words in an everyday sense, and we're not committed to the carefully honed and chiseled boundaries that academics have given them necessarily, but that then through weird feedback loops get folded back into society to construct their own boundaries. They become reified. But you're in the business of teams, and one of the big one of the very, 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 very big perplexing questions that we have in cognitive science is how to understand an individual, a collective, the relationship between an individual and collective. It's not just cognitive science has this question. Everyone has this question. But we get to pose it in particularly acute and well-articulated forms sometimes. So the absence of any definition of mind, for example, makes it very easy to engage in mind talk and make that extend over a group of people. The kind of team that you run, I believe, they've been studied using the register of the language of cognitive science as a cognitive agent, as a team, by a guy called Ed Hutchins, and the notion of distributed cognition. Cognition in the Wild is his book that you really need to read. Well, no, I'm not telling you what you need to read, Daniel. I'm sorry, I retract that. I will not say that. But he's a pivotal example where those terms that we use to shore up some kind of a half-assed account of ourselves as individuals transfer seamlessly to teams. Once you're talking in terms of behavior, the achievement of goals, the solving of problems, those are things that can be done collectively just as well as by an individual, probably better. And so in many respects, many of the words that were curated within a particular kind of cognitive science turn out to work better for teams than they do for individuals.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those moments where when I first heard Marvin Minsky's Society of Mind concept, and I read Embodied Mind by Varela, Roche and Thompson, and they're talking about different elements of like what I think of as me, what we think of as me, what I think of as me consists of something that, or you could frame it as, it looks like something that looks like a team, all coordinating and different, I don't know, pandemonium architectures and all different like agents within my own being, all vying for control over my language, over my actions, and they all have their own sort of different like preferences or concerns, and they all collaborate together to produce this seemingly unified thing called a Daniel. And my mind is more like a team, and therefore maybe my team is like a mind by the same extension. And this concept of mind can grow from like a single cell it's trying to survive in the brain or in the nervous system, up to the organ, which is its own kind of mind, which is contributing to the being, the organism, which then goes up to the hive or the swarm or the team, and it will just sort of you start getting into quite highfalutin ideas when you start talking about things like
Oh, you can go higher than that. You should shoot higher. Teilhard de Chardin was a Jesuit philosopher, very interesting ideas, metaphysical ideas, and he imagined that there was a sphere around what we call the world, which was pure intelligence. He called it the noosphere. You can think that way. It's a very elevated way to think. There's nothing wrong with it. It's shifting sand, though, isn't it, when you don't quite know who the elements in the thing you're thinking about are, or what the bounds of it are. Because, and here's where cognitive science encounters some rather contemporary difficulties, your willingness to consider yourself as the hazy average of a bunch of interacting processes, or as the outcome of a lot of subterranean or distinct processes, none of which is you, that might work for you and it might not work for you, depending on how you view yourself intuitively, what your self-understanding is, how neurotic you are, how psychotic you are, and what your religious stance on yourself is. Unfortunately, you see, all these go into how a person views themselves and their position in the world. Now, of course, if we speak of science as a thing, then we just ventured into terrible territory. Get out of here. Religion, superstition, woo, woo. But if we don't, if we realize that every inquirer occupies a position in the world, they're all finite, and the questions we're asking trouble some of the generally accepted ways in which we talk about both individuals and collectives, then you realize that, oh, hang on. Yeah, this is not chemistry. We're doing something different here.
Yeah. And I think that's something that characterizes the agile approach, or the approach that I take to like management and teams, which is like you're not doing chemistry here. You're not dealing with hard systems with very repeatable, predictable outcomes. You're dealing with complex, often chaotic, unpredictable, evolving, emerging qualities. And therefore, if I'm going to manage a team like that, I should understand something about those systems. Now, what intuitions do I have to help me manage a system like a team? Well, how do I, as an individual that consists of all these bits, go and manage my world around me? And actually, I'm quite good at, like, just before we hit record as well, I was giving you a slight overview of, well, agile is this approach where we do small things and see what happens. And why do we need to say that? Well, we know that in our lives often that, like, you know, if I'm going on a car trip up to Scotland, I know that I'm not going to plan every steering wheel turn. I know that I'm going to like set a general direction and understand the constraints and then like adapt and change direction if I need to, blah, blah, blah. But then when we get into organizations and we get into bigger systems where there's less feedback and you can get away with, or you're being encouraged to assert control over something, then all of a sudden we forget that intuition for small iterative steps, and we create a different kind of organization that is not well adapted.
You're appealing to something called intuition there, and intuition is a fascinating word. The stuff that, who knows where that stuff comes from. What you're suggesting is that we're thinking on our feet, on the hoof. I often find it helps to discuss a concrete example rather than things in general. And if what we're troubling is the role of our explicit individual centralized plans and their execution in an uncertain interactive context, then football is a very good place to look. Because we know what's going on in a football game, right? And a football player may make plans all they wish, and just like your steering wheel on the way up to Scotland, that's not going to be no use whatsoever. And in what you're referring to there vaguely as intuition is actually the skill of playing football. You just put your finger on the skill of playing football.
Yeah, well, like recognizing the patterns that are emerging and knowing what to do in that uncertainty.
An observer would look on and say, "Oh, you know what to do in that certainty." But if I zoom in on a heated moment in a football match where a striker spots an opportunity and takes a lash at goal, I don't find it very helpful to think of them as knowing anything. I see them doing, because we do, and we reflectively parcel this out and try to separate knowing from doing all the time. That's part of the problem we get into. But you can see clearly that in the case of a striker caught in mid-action, that's going to be of limited use in understanding what's going on. The genius of the striker is not troubled by this, but I don't think the striker is solving differential equations in their head or revising last year's strategy. They're too busy for that. And we are always too busy, really, except when we sit back and say, I wonder how I did that. How did you tie your shoelaces this morning?
Yeah. I remember when I was growing up, there was something on one of the kids' programs I was watching that was like, David Beckham, clearly not an intelligent man, right? But look at him do all this interesting stuff with a ball. He must have something, but it's clearly not what we're used to as intelligence. And it was like kind of making fun of the way he speaks, but then showing what genius he was with the ball. And now I look at that and I'm like, what a completely preposterous thing. Like, what elitist and unkind and just absurd distinction to make there. And you mentioned this thing between knowing and doing. Can you say a bit more about what do you mean that we intuitively, or we often reflexively distinguish knowing from doing, and what might that result in? Why do you think we do that?
Why do we do? Well, we have a long history of doing that. Why do I think we do that? We like to form pictures of how we think we are. They're deluded, but we need such pictures and we try. But actually, we're always in the middle of things. For example, I'm speaking words right now, and I assure you there's no deliberative process going on behind those. They're coming out in real time. I don't actually know what the next words are that are going to come out. And this is the nature of ongoing activity in real time. It's always like this. But we sit and think and reflect and project back, and that induces in our picture of ourselves a separation between us and that with which we are engaged. Nothing I'm doing right now makes sense without you, Daniel. These words could not come out unless you were right there. It's hard to point on these things, but I'm pointing at you.
This guy.
Yeah. You're very obvious to me right here. And you're completely influencing. No, this conversation is a joint production. We're doing this together. I'm not doing it and you're not doing it. We're doing it together. A conversational domain is one of the best examples of how we are actually collaboratively doing everything. But afterwards, we could go back and we could say, oh, why did I say that word? Oh, my God, what was I thinking? Well, I assure you I'm not thinking. No time for it. I'm busy talking.
So we want to. So the reason or the way in which we distinguish knowing from doing is like retrospectively. I look back at something that really where knowing and doing were entangled, right? Like, Daniel, how do I know how to have this conversation with Fred? Like, don't know. I'm just doing it, and it seems to be nice. And I might look back and go, well, actually, I guess I knew that because I used to have conversations about science with my lecturers at university, so I guess I had some knowledge there. Whereas, and then I did it. I performed my knowledge out there with those carefully honed conversational skills about science. I then went and like performed it on a podcast, and that's a meaningless distinction, or that is a retrospective fantasy. Or
the trouble, Daniel. I think there's an issue we have to raise here. We talk and think about ourselves all the time. Some of that talk is psychological in nature. Psychology is the business of talking about who we think we are. There's everyday folk psychology where we use words in an everyday sense, and we tend not to get into too much trouble when we do that, as long as we're not trying to do cognitive science. Psychology also has a scientific side, which is I distance myself from completely. And that's most people would not understand why that happens. But in psychological theorizing, we tend to build up a notion of an inside controller or an executive or someone who's in charge. For God's sake, I hope, ego or someone's in charge in here. And such models lead then to a separation of subject from world. And they lead to discussion of an inner organization in terms of memory, as it conceived of as some kind of database, faculties of judgment, perception. Perception is now that word perception is really problematic. But when this tragic separation happens, then we speak of perception as taking in something, deliberating, and we've separated perception and action. And that always raises problems. But I'd like to give you a concrete example of this, because this is a bit theoretical. But what I want to do is take an elaborated example that you may have met and discuss it, and then discuss what I did yesterday, okay? The elaborated example I want to mention comes from a paper called The Extended Mind. It's a very famous paper from 1998 by Dave Chalmers and Andy Clark, sorry, authors the other way around. The Extended Mind put forward a very cogent argument that such psychological theories are mistaken in attributing everything to an inside, and that what they're talking about is distributed in the world. Now, that's, on one hand, it's kind of a philosophical argument. It's about how are we talking about mind. On the other, to people who have a psychology training, I confront them with this paper every year. It's devastating. Your mind is leaking out of your head. How on earth are we going to do psychology if your mind leaks out of the head? And there's a central example in there that contrasts two people, Otto and Anna. And they're both going to the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And Anna, who's presumed neuronormal, Anna's Grand, nothing wrong with Anna. Anna gets up, she knows where the gallery is, and she goes there and has a lovely day. Good for you, Anna. Otto has Alzheimer's, so he has memory problems, but he's very skilled in coping with his memory problems, so he has a notebook where he writes things down. Otto gets up and decides to go to the Museum of Modern Art. As part of the process of getting there, he's going to have to consult his notebook because that's where the address is. He can't recall it because he's got Alzheimer's. But he does so successfully, and he goes to the Museum of Modern Art, and he has a great day too. I hope Otto and Anna go for a cup of coffee. But the point is, if you're thinking in terms of memory, as the psychologists conceive it, Anna used her memory to get there, and Otto used his notebook. Whereas, from a sufficiently distant position, they both just used whatever they had available to them in order to cope with getting to the Museum of Modern Art. So it's a bit funny to introduce a categorical distinction between them. It suggests that this notion of memory as something private in the head is a bit precious. Now, there's way more problems with memory than that, but that's a lovely example that worked for some people because it took a core psychological concept of memory. It provided an illustration, clearly, where memory seemed to, in one case, not involve a notebook, in another, involve a notebook. So that's helpful for people when they're trying to figure out what's right and wrong about the ways we talk about mind. So the example I want to give you, yesterday, by chance, I decided to go to the Museum of Modern Art here in Dublin. And it's out on the west side. And I was driving there and I was thinking about Otto and I was thinking about Anna. And it occurred to me, of course, because I'm driving down the road on my way, how am I going to get to the Museum of Modern Art? How do I know where to get to the... And I realized I didn't. I didn't know how to get to the Museum of Modern Art, so I consider my options. I don't know if I have Alzheimer's, but option one was don't think about Otto and Anna and just go to the goddamn museum. I've been there many times before. I'm confident I can get there. But I just don't know the route. I couldn't imagine the routes. I'm just confident I would get there. But I was thinking about Otto and Anna too much. And I realized, well, hang on, my brother lives just a mile away. I could drop in and ask my brother or see if he wants to come with me. Actually, I was arranged to meet my brother. I thought I might pick him up there. Because of that, it proved easier to go in. I dropped off there and I asked, he had already gone to the Museum of Modern Art. So I asked his wife and she gave me directions that made my head spin. So I got in the car and did what I was going to do anyway, which is Wayfair, which is just go with confidence. And I ended up at the museum immediately. So neither case was a good description. I don't have the Alzheimer's. I didn't have an explicit knowledge. My memory doesn't function as simply as Anna's does in this thing. And there's a whole lot going on underneath the hood in any real case that's quite way more complex than this pristine example. But I wanted to give you that as an example of how we lay out an argument to make something clear about how is this psychological construct working. And then to observe that even when we do that clearly, we're simplifying. We're simplifying, and it's very useful to consider such theories as they relate to yourself while you're doing things rather than after the fact, as providing the explanatory categories after the fact. So that's just the story of yesterday anyway.
It's a great one. There's a bunch of different directions I want to go in. So one level is, that's a really nice illustration for someone might be listening to this and say, I have a psychology degree, or I've read some linguistics or whatever. Why are these things interplaying with each other? Like, why does philosophy matter when it comes to the way I do psychology? And I think that's a really nice example where Dave Chalmers and Andy Clark are philosophers by training, right? Well, that's like where their main grounding is. And it's like philosophy and psychology will ask certain questions, but from certain sort of unspoken starting points. And philosophy gets to say, hang on, those unspoken starting points, where are you drawing those definitions around where a mind is? You, psychologists, might be drawing it as if it only is within the skin, but I'm going to give you a thought experiment or an intuition pump that shows you that it could be wider. It could include a notebook, or it could include Fred's sister-in-law, and it would be just as much an example of the mind, and to broaden it beyond that. But I was thinking when you were saying this idea that we imagine that we have a sort of central executive or a central controller, and then that divides me from the world, right? Where is this central controller thing? Well, that's the essence of my mind or my being, and it's different from this body, and it coordinates all the other functions, and it sees stuff, and it understands things, and it's different from the world. And now I am my own thing, and I'm different from the world around me. I'm thinking back to that team level where we might say, like, where does the work come in? Where does the team begin and end? Is there like a central executive within a team, or is a team a sort of self-organizing, dynamic entity that is always shape-shifting around a certain problem? And the categories of like what shape is an idea when it comes to a team, and how can I have it perfectly set up for the team to deal with, and how can I perfectly piece it up so that the team can digest it? All these things are difficult to do. And I think there's a parallel that I'm working on whether it's reasonable to draw, which is just as the people who consider mind to be a sort of separate quality, and there's like one individual and a kind of dualism there's like a me inside and there's a world outside, and my cognition is the process of the me computing all the different data and then spitting out some actions. That reflects a way of managing organizations as well, right? Where you imagine that things are sort of fixed and controllable, and it's just a case of getting the right data in and doing the right computation and spitting out the right answer. Whereas, and maybe it'd be a good time soon to introduce this 4E idea. We've already looked at extended through that paper, but the people who have intuitions about mind being something that is embodied, embedded, enacted, extended, and understand that kind of, you can't draw such fixed boundaries around stuff. Those people will have different conceptions of how to manage an organization or a team, and they'll be more grounded in the reality, which is that things shift, things are dynamic. You take coalitions of people together in different combinations, and they uncleanly solve a problem via committee in all these extended and entangled ways. I still need to find a better way of expressing that than what I just said, but that's this idea.
Well, let me come back again. I do like concrete examples. I noted that some of the questions we ask, or some of the schooling we can do for our thinking when it comes to considering the performance of a distributed group of people, a team, are well served by the example of football, because we know what we're talking about. And when we're doing a model of David Beckham playing football, we don't care about David Beckham the lover, or David Beckham the poet, or David Beckham the cook, or David Beckham that's just sitting there and actually petting the cat, or David Beckham having a religious experience. There's sides to David Beckham we are not addressing when we view David Beckham as a football player. And of course, if football's our bag, that's totally fine. But we realise the game we're playing. We're viewing football. We're viewing football players. So team members are the same. I mean, the people in your team, they also are musicians, lovers, and wanderers, and gadflies, and mischief makers, and artists. You know, they have all these sides to them as well. But viewing them in the context of your team, you don't want to deny those sides. You just want to temporarily exclude them. So you're not dealing with the human person. You're dealing with the team member in this context.
Yeah, or a role, or their skill that they're bringing, or their... Yeah. In which case, like, the unit analysis is the action, right? It's the problem to be solved. It's not the human and all of their...
We think best when we place frames around our thinking, when we constrain our thinking somewhat and don't just think into the abstract. And if collectivities are your bag, something like a football is good because the bounds of the game are clear. With software development, I don't know what the bounds of the game are. There's financial issues involved. There's social and ethical issues. There's a political feeling of people on the staff. There's personal disagreements among people in your teams, I'm going to guess. And there's that goddamn neighbour upstairs who won't shut up with the jackhammer. There's all kinds of things that don't fit this idealization. But if team thinking is your bag, then place bounds around it and think about it like that. But don't mistake that for doing human psychology. That's not what it is. It's doing... it's consideration of collective achievement of teams.
I think that's another thing that attracts me to cognitive science, is that in my world, and I probably am just guilty of this, there's a lot of this neuro coaching or neuro-informed coaching or psychology-informed coaching. And it basically takes a slice of something that may or may not have backing in a science of a time in a context and says, here's how we can apply this to your team. And I like doing that with cognitive science, because cognitive science is so unwilling to, or at least in my experience of it, so unwilling to take a form that can be like shoehorned into this is the cognitive science way of running your team. Like, no, cognitive science would recognize, or at least in the way that I'm understanding it, would recognize the problems of applying any model to any other model, and the assumptions that you're making, and the metaphors that you are like relying on imperfectly but usefully, maybe. So it's very hard to be like, well, this is the cognitive science way of running a software team. It wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah, there was a couple of words that came up there. One of them was neuro. That's always a complicated word, neuro. A lot of letters in that one. But then you mentioned that there might be a discipline that would tell you how to consider the people in your teams. Cognitive psychology will tend to do that, you see. Cognitive psychology will form that kind of view, but cognitive psychology is a socio-technically articulated discipline that is no longer about real people at all. Cognitive science is often much more reluctant to pronounce on things or provide firm directions, but rather to illuminate what the issues are. Neuroscience is our greatest area of speculation as humans. Because we think very highly of brains, and we think very highly of individuals, and we find one brain in each body, we have done some of our most spectacular theorizing, fantasizing, and projection onto the brain and the role of the nervous system. I've learned and been inspired by such work enormously, but I realize the idealization is involved. We do not have a command or an understanding of the brain or the nervous system that actually allows that. It's very important to see that what we're engaged in is a form of idealism, a form of ideal treatment. So there's great inspiration to be drawn from neuroscience, but that becomes toxic if it's taken as firm pronouncements about the person or their being.
It's like looking at a home through the lens of like the electricity system that runs through it or something, or the fridge. It's like, yeah, there's a way in which I don't know if this is a guess, but it's like, yeah, there's a way in which you could cut the experience of like a functioning home as all being about the fridge, because it seems to sit there at the center of all the meals, and like, yeah, it runs through the electricity system, and yeah, that does make sense. It does a lot of important stuff, but it doesn't describe the full experience of a family home. What do you think about on the fly now?
I think that's nice, very well put. But I think the problem is several orders of magnitude worse than that. And I find it interesting that you picked on the electricity system, which is, of course, a vital part of the infrastructure of any modern home, at least around here. You didn't choose the plumbing system because we don't think of the brain as plumbing, but we think of the brain as electricity. And that, unfortunately, is a myth that was introduced in 1943 by Warren McCullough, who convinced people that the brain was some kind of sparky object, and that the spikes that one can register, electrical spikes one can register on a neuron, were actually logical bits. It was a religious inspiration. He's a bit of a prophet, Warren McCullough is, but unfortunately society, or at least the collective imagination, swallowed this wholesale. It's quite conventional to think of the brain as a kind of an electrical object, which is nothing other than a Frankensteinian spark. We don't know enough about the brain to signal out electricity. It's electrochemically active. There's an awful lot going on in electrochemical activation, but people use the word brain activation or brain activity, and they mean nothing. We do not know what we're measuring. But people have swallowed hook, line and sinker the idea that we're reading an electrical object and that we can decode its signals. And that's it's pervasive. I'm not going to talk the world out of that. I'm doing a series of videos right now where I point out that, hang on, even the brain doesn't exist. We talk about the brain, but we're using that for shorthand for, part of the central nervous system. Now, that's to introduce an arbitrary cut in the nervous system. But even to speak of the nervous system as if it achieved anything without its complement, which are muscles, nervous systems and muscles form a complementary pair, is inchoate. So those models that are developed along those lines, they're wonderful for thinking with. They're extremely stimulating, but they're hugely ideal. So your electrical system is influenced by Warren McCullough there, whether you know it or not.
Unconscious, so to speak. So when you said earlier, like logical bits, as in, is it that we imagine, and not imagine, we are told explicitly, your neurons are like a 1 or a 0. They fire or they don't fire. And in that way, it is like a bit of information in a computer saying like a 1 or a 0.
You just summed up the abstract of the 1943 paper I'm talking about, Warren McCullough and Walter Pitts, on logical calculus. I forget the full name of the paper, but it's very, very famous. And you summed it up. He said a neuron produces a spike or it doesn't. We could think of that as a logical bit. And then he ignores all details, starts hooking them up and creating electrical circuit diagrams drawn from logic, not drawn from brains. He's already decided, he's already full in on the neuron doctrine, which is that the neuron is the right thing to pay attention to in a brain. We know no such thing. We have learned since that this idealization of the neuron is complete bollocks. There's loads of other cells in the brain, and they're all interacting in really complicated, goopy ways whose complexity defies any such analysis. In other words, Warren gave us just the picture we needed to develop a cybernetic image of ourselves. And it worked very, very well.
Can you define cybernetic in that context?
Right, I use the word cybernetic to describe the wholesale shift in vocabulary and imagination space that arose after the Second World War with the combination of the availability of the computing metaphor, a reified notion of information coming from Shannon's work, obsession with questions of communication and control, and developed it in a very interdisciplinary fashion, largely due to the effects of war, actually. But there was a great deal of interdisciplinary thinking, and there was also a willingness after the horrors of the Second World War and the utter failure of humanity in the first half of the 20th century. There was a willingness to sort of wholesale adopt a new cosmological vision. Now, cybernetics is the basis for artificial intelligence, for computer science, for all kinds of studies of feedback and control systems. It has split. It's not a single discipline anymore. But that vocabulary became lodged. It's now our native language for talking about ourselves. We think about ourselves and express ourselves using these terms, and it takes some archaeology to uncover what we used to say before these. If you read anything before the Second World War, you're reading stuff that's not of the cybernetic imagination. If you read it after the Second World War, you're reading stuff within the cybernetic imagination.
So what is a way that we colloquially might refer to ourselves that is actually got its grounding in a cybernetic orientation?
If you use the word information processing or computing, those are cybernetic terms. So cybernetics is, as I say, it invaded our consciousness, and it now supports all kinds of positions. There's no cybernetic position on something. So 4E theories grow out of cybernetics, as do the most absurd artificial intelligence theories, as do the fantasies of control and cognitive psychology. These all grow out of cybernetics. Cybernetics is just the language we inherited. The way I put it is this. Science, as we know it in modernity, seems to start around the time of Descartes and Newton, 1600, let's say. For the first, up until about the middle of the 19th century, science was natural philosophy, and you could not do it and publish unless your theories were acceptable to the theologians. So Darwin's theory was utterly heretical. People before Darwin had tried to introduced similar theories, including his grandfather, and couldn't. Frankenstein was written in exile because these were not safe. You couldn't talk unless you fitted the theological model. Around the middle of the 19th century, that changed. So Darwin comes and tells us we're in the natural order and we're not the rational souls of Christian theology. Science splits and fractures and becomes technology and becomes part of an economy and becomes a professionalized area. And now, suddenly, you're not allowed to mention God in your scientific papers. God dies about 1850. It's not just Nietzsche's pronouncement. Prior to 1850, from 1600 to 1850, you must fit the theological framework. From 1850 on, you don't. But from 1850 to 1945, it's perfectly fine to appeal to another mythical being called man, to inquire into human nature and try to find out what is man really. Now, loads of people are still doing that, of course, but it's utter bullshit. Since 1945, man died in 1945. If you've read any existential philosophy, if you've encountered the Holocaust and the Shoah, if you know how broken humanity was in 1945, you realize that God died in 1850, man died in 1945, and the reason cybernetics took over is because we're looking for a language. Sorry, that's a bit big, but it's helpful.
So this construction, this mythical beast of man is dead, and I want to...
Well, as I say, ideally, people are still chasing it. Like Chomsky, for example, is defining human nature. That's exactly... Chomsky is still chasing man. That's my objection to this program.
So you touched on something there with information processing, and even when we got back to the neurons being bits and things, is it not just the case that my brain is like a computer and my eyes are the sort of camera, and the information comes in, and my brain and my nervous system and maybe some chemicals as well do some sort of computation and spits out an answer just like a robot does, and just, you know, gives me some action, and then I get in a sort of a loop there where I do something, and then the whole thing starts again. Information comes in, brain computations, and then out. That's fair, right?
I can find no fault with that at all. You see how easy it is to think along computational grounds, especially when you have a whole bunch of technological metaphors. All technology is pure magic. You've no idea how your computer works. Let's face it. Your computer is doing shit there in front of you, and you have no blessed clue how it's doing it. But you can think with it, and you can think about yourself with it, and fine. I mean, is it realistic? No.
So what are some of the ways in which this computational metaphor has come to pervade our understanding of what cognition is, and what are some of the limitations of that? What are some of the things that tell me that actually that's not so much the case?
This is not an easy one, but I'm going to try my best. Because the language is so pervasive and it has settled and made itself at home inside my head as well as yours. These are the languages, the words we speak and think about ourselves in. We can't do otherwise than think with the ideas we have.
Even just saying inside my head there was another example, right?
Yeah. Oh man, my brain's nearly full now. Hang on, we're going to carry on here. You see, I can think like that. It doesn't do any great damage. But I think I can help out here. The word cognitive it features very, very often, and if you ask people what they mean, they get kind of annoyed. Cognitive, when it's uttered in any context, is going to mean it's going to point in one of two directions. One is our understanding of how we achieve something, do something, solve problems, meet goals, make plans, do something. That is a constructive use of the term cognition. There's nothing wrong with it, but that is the question of behavior and control, and it produces a mechanical view of mind in which goals appear. We're thinking about ourselves as we're the kind of thing that solves problems. How do we solve those problems? That's nearly always what's meant with cognition. But if it's pointed out that that is mechanistic thinking and you missed something, what does it miss? Well, people are drawn to the word cognition because of their own sentience, their own minded perspective on things. The troublemaker of the word consciousness is in there, and people think when they're talking about cognition it goes in that direction too. I like to say cognitive science these days is soul science, just to see how people respond to that. Because that soul science end is not matched by the behavioral control end. But people, even if they're leaning on the behavioral control model, at the back of their mind, they know cognition is important because it's their own bleeding brilliance, isn't it? It's their own importance. If there's no cognition, oh my God, I'm a robot. Oh God. So those two senses of cognition coexist, and they're both in play nearly every time the word is uttered. I like to try to draw a distinction when we're using it in a constructive behavioral sense, in which case we are not revealing truths about ourselves. We are constructing teams, for example, to achieve software product releases or score goals. And don't tell me we shouldn't score goals or know how we score goals or shouldn't know how we could. We should. It's brilliant thinking. But it's not what people seem to think it is, which is getting to the soul or the self or the I. That has nothing to do with the other question, you see. So there's where a lot of the confusion comes from. Now, I can't undo the way people think and the way they draw on the terms that are available to them. Your eyes are cameras. Where's the film? You see, if you pursue any such metaphor, and these are just random metaphors, you pursue it ever so slightly, it becomes hilariously ridiculous. But we teach patently ridiculous stuff.
So, like, someone who's familiar with like how a digital camera will work will know that there's pixels and the light comes in and the information then registers on a pixel and on some sort of photosensitive thing, and then it transmits the information along to some central computing thing that then produces an image somewhere on a screen or in a data bank or something. So why are my retinas not just visual pixels, and then each sort of bit of the retina is a sort of pixel, and when the light comes in, I'm getting like the red, and then I get some red, and then I just like form a picture in my brain somewhere. What's wrong with that?
It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't mean anything. That's what's wrong with it. It's a little cartoon you just drew. It falls apart as soon as you look at it. Those pixels you speak of are not actually discrete elements. That's an abstraction. There are no discrete pixels, despite what everybody is taught in school. If you look at the engineering of a pixel, you'll find it's a complex modulation of continuous functions. There are no... But we build machines that allow us to act as if there were pixels, yes. But thereafter, information going into the brain, I mean, that's not what a brain is. Have you ever looked at a brain? It's an organ of the body. It looks like a kidney. It's not a projection it's not a cinema.
So what is, and so one of the things that I'm interested in is how like vision is a dividing point between the computationalists and the non-computationalists. So we recognize that this computational model has come into our cognition a bit, and we may, as our technology gets more advanced, some people may read that computational model of how cognition works into the cool new camera that they've got and on their camera phone, and then they go, oh right, my eyes are like the camera from my camera phone, and I can it works like that. I'm thinking in particular about David Marr explaining the 3 levels of computation and an algorithm and implementation, and like, you know, this is how we can make sense of vision through the sense of information processing. And then,
well, yeah, David Marr, we need to put a little wrapper around David Marr's work. David Marr died tragically young, and he was doing his work at a time when computationalism was coming to some kind of a frothy pitch. And so most of it he founded by pretty much the computational analysis of images, the field of the computational analysis of images, which proceeds to this day and is the basis for all the work that does things like face recognition on phones and so on. He founded that, but that was not his actual... well, we don't know where he would have gone because he was not inspired by internalist psychological theories, oddly enough. He was inspired by James J. Gibson, whose approach to vision is completely different from that of those who traffic in images and stuff going into the head. Gibson's work is relational and seeks to understand how light, the structuring of light is important in modulating the ongoing activity of an organism. So we don't know where David... I don't want to make David Marr personally responsible for the ghastly field of computational vision, but he did accidentally found it. That's true.
So say a bit more about Gibson, because this is maybe the selfish bit of the episode where like there's some stuff that I'm interested in that I reckon is like way too niche for the audience, but I hope they can come along. I just want to ask a cognitive scientist about the significance of Gibson and Marr and affordances and ecological approaches to give us a primer on how that.
Right. Well, I can do that in a fairly simple fashion. Gibson has been liberating influence on many people precisely because he refused to traffic in these fantasies of internalism. One reason he did so, he was a trained psychologist and he was trained in the behavioral methods of his day. He was very well trained and he was given some very practical jobs. One of the jobs he had to do was figure out how pilots land planes in conditions of poor visibility. And in doing so, the constructs of psychology were of absolutely no use to him. What he had to do instead was pay attention to the way light works when someone is moving in a specific structured environment, and how that play of light is lawfully related to things that matter to the organism. So if you're flying a plane into a cliff, for example, don't do this. If you're flying a plane into a cliff, as you approach the cliff, all the optical textures on the textured patterns on your retina are going to loom. They're going to expand like this. You can get the same thing just by walking towards a wall. You know the way things loom. Well, there you go, looming like that. And that's happening on the retina. And that's really informative. The rate at which that looming happens will tell you how quickly you're going to hit the cliff. There's no need to appeal to the inside. So what Gibson was doing was paying attention to the concrete embodied situation of an organism and the role that light plays in there. What it didn't give you was a theory of images, of pictorial representation, of mental images. It's strictly non-internalist. And that was proved hugely liberating for a lot of people because we had almost no theories that didn't traffic in Christian Protestant fantasies. I'm just going to put a name on it, available. And so it provoked a lot of work, which continues to this day, as people try to find a different register to address these questions in, which is grounded strongly in a physical vocabulary. And this approach has proved to be useful. For example, some of the people who are the most enthusiastic adopters of insights from this are people who are coaches. I believe that might be relevant. People who study team. So sports training, for example, ecological psychology is very, very useful for sports training, but it's behaviorist and it's trapped in a physicalist register. It doesn't satisfy many of us, myself included. I recognize its great power and its huge contribution, but I'm not myself an ecological psychologist. So it represented a break with an entirely, I'm going to say it, batshit insane way of talking about vision. I did a series of videos on how batshit insane. It seems like I have a bee in my bonnet here. I did a series of videos on that take through the various kinds of theories of vision we have and how the idealizations that are associated with images and intake, how crazy they are, but how they've developed and been supported and how they've changed our imagination and the way we think about vision. And nobody has a good theory of seeing. Don't confuse vision with seeing, you see. That's what we all do.
I was about to just go ahead and confuse vision with seeing. You call me. So just to zoom out a level here, and there's a bunch of other topics I want to make sure we have time for. Just before we started, we hit record. We had a question between the two of us, which is: Are we just going to be able to talk and go? And I think we're getting there. So before Gibson, if I'm thinking about vision, I've got certain models of how that works that are based on this internalism, like it's an internal experience and it's pictures being brought in and it's kind of coherent with information processing and it doesn't have any sensible grounding in what actually happens biologically speaking. See Cummins et al. Videos for reasons why. And then Gibson comes along and says there's ways to understand some of the visual experiences that are just based in the body, and you don't need to have a brain that takes the information and processes it and represents it and does sort of abstract computation on it. Just from the structure of how the light changes on the retina, that can explain how an organism can perceive looming experiences.
No. You're using the word explain, and don't be a tech bro. It doesn't explain it. It might be relevant to our understanding what's going on. That's the difference. I hate this passion for explaining. It's like you're trying to kill something. Nobody has an explanation for how we perceive the world. Absolutely nobody. And your picture there was totally ahistorical because before Gibson, nobody had the elaborated computational fantasies that we have now. People think with the advent of computers that we've solved everything. Well, all we've done is push the mystery out. Nobody. Vision seeing has always been full of mystery, and it's always been explored in lots of registers without any clear picture of what's going on. Back in the day of John Locke, he received an inquiry from a guy called Molyneux, which was a very interesting question, which shows how people were thinking back then. He said, supposing there was someone who was blind from birth, and then we restore their sight, and they're sitting down, and they had known the difference between a cube and a sphere, tactilely. If they don't touch them, can they tell visually the difference between a cube and a sphere? A very interesting question, and it gave them, there was hundreds of years of thought on this. And in the 20th century, there were occasional empirical cases where the miracle happened and we found an answer to it. The answer is no, you got to pick them up and feel, you got to learn to wield vision. It's a skill, it's a form of active engagement with the world. But so that question has been lingering around for a couple of hundred years. So people have always thought in very rich ways about this, but the facile idea that we can explain things using information processing is the magic sauce that just kind of gets rid of all these problems. That's tragic.
And when I think about that as an agile person, as a team person, I'm thinking about like the ways in which we conceptualize like a team sensing its environment or sensing its customer or understanding stuff. And if we have these quite coarse perceptions of, well, it's just information in, and then I just and then I spit out the right answer. Well, that's not how sensing works in the body, and you're missing out on some opportunities to understand the world in a way that if you got it right, and if you incorporated broader understandings of vision, of cognition in different ways, maybe you would set up your teams differently and you wouldn't just take like requirements in, software out. You would have a much more dynamic, interactive relation with your user, with the rest of your organism, or something like that. And if you see the team as in a relationship with the users of the product or the users of the service, whatever the team is doing, maybe you offer yourself much better opportunities to do your job well than if you see it from that computational information in, answer out.
Yeah, well, that's one of the reasons that the word information has such utility, despite it not meaning much. When we speak of, so we've an epistemological tradition in Europe in which we tend to speak of epistemology in terms of senses and concepts.
So epistemology is the study of like, how do I know about the world around me, right? Or
it's cognitive science, knowing, study of knowing. And the senses are presumed to be sort of body bound, and we've traditionally talked about them as seeing, hearing, tasting, touching, smelling. A very, very useful way of talking. I've never had a problem with it myself, outside of cognitive science, and it's a way of talking about ourselves that has arisen in other cultures, not within this the immediate shadow of European scientific modernity. So it arose in India as well, and some people chose to put a sixth sense in there, which is mental formations. The Buddhists did this. Buddhists have very interesting contributions to make to cognitive science. What I wanted to suggest is that talking about senses in this informal way, it turns out to be very useful. They don't map onto what we know about the body. We don't find 5 senses in the body. We don't find 5 kinds of receptors. We don't find separate pathways for hearing and seeing and so on. And we've been shoring up this problem ever since. But relying on the diaphanous, spirit-laden notion of information allows us to make progress nonetheless, because we can free ourselves of the reliance we thought we had but we never had on the senses of the body, and speak instead of sensitivities. When you're talking about information, you're talking about stuff to which your team might be sensitive. Gregory Bateson had this wonderful notion of information as a difference that makes a difference. So if something happens outside in the outside world and it doesn't affect your team, they're not sensitive to it. But if, for example, there's a big scandal, right, and Daniel it turns out to be involved in drug running in Colombia, and people start questioning their allegiance to the organization, they're sensitive to that particular thing. So we say, oh, it was informative to them. So information has taken over this role of trying, as a placeholder for all of our sensitivities. And our sensitivities are not innumerable, and they don't come in 5 varieties, and they're not captured by physical variables. Our sensitivities are to things like the mood of a room.
And those things are really important because often the interesting stuff in a team or in an organization is the stuff that they're sensitive to, that the organization doesn't want them to be sensitive to. The organization, the management wants them to be, just like looking at the user or looking at the technology and just like creating a great service. In reality, teams are often sensitive to management changes or pay structure stuff or all sorts of things that are like impacting their cognition and their ability to solve the problem. And as management, you can either be you can either incorporate that and handle it well, or you can wish it wasn't there and treat them as if they're troublemakers. And that's not an approach that works very well in organizations, from what I've seen.
If I was running a football team, I would have a rule on my football team: nobody takes their mobile phone onto the pitch. I don't think anyone does take their mobile. It's about the only place left that you're not forced to take your mobile phone on. But it's understood that in the context of a game, your sensitivities should be restricted to those that pertain to the game. And if a family member dies during the game, that news can wait for an hour and a half. Well, not if it's a local game, but, if there's money involved. So sensitivities are... The sensitivities of your team are not necessarily solely to those sources that are relevant to the professed goals of the team. The sensitivities of the team will be impacted by, for example, COVID, which lays waste to everybody's plans, but you're sensitive to it and it's affecting things. Whereas sensitivity to a competitor's move in the market, for example, a competitor has introduced a new project that causes you to change your path forward. That's also a sensitivity. It's a sensitivity that's relevant to the organization goals. So sensitivities won't be bounded. But yeah, that's one way we use the word information is simply to acknowledge that we're sensitive to all kinds of things we couldn't put a word on.
What is the difference between coordination and control?
Coordination's longer. More letters.
So the reason I'm asking that question is it was a cool distinction that I saw come up in one of your videos about how the body coordinates rather than is controlled by the brain.
Well, yeah. Let me go back to what I said about the 2 senses of cognition. One, how do we achieve something? What are the means by which we succeed in our goals and manage? And the other one to do with a much more numinous, unelaborated sense of personal subjectivity, consciousness, being in the world. For 25 years now, I've taught a cognitive science syllabus I put myself, and it necessarily includes a lot of behavior. Psychologists are very interested in behavior. Behavior is always normative. Behaviors can succeed or fail. They are not, in other words, a naturalistic register. Behavior is someone else's reading of what you did. And so I have to teach behavior science, but I've always insisted on teaching movement science as well. Now, most people don't know movement science even exists, but there's lots of people who study movement who look at the manner in which the parts of the body, inside the body, between bodies, in groups, in individuals, with tools, swinging out of trees, the way all this hangs together. Some of the earliest studies were done by a guy called Edward Muybridge. You will be familiar from the internet of pictures of horses galloping done in an old Victorian style. That's the movement science. And in a more modern version, I point recently to the work of Scott Kelso, an Irishman, who studies a field called coordination dynamics. It takes a strongly empirical view to the way in which parts hang together as movement unfolds. Now, the lesson to be learned from this is that movement science never sees behavior. Movement science sees only smooth, fluid coordination. That's the way animals move. And most movement science looks at animals, although some looks at humans. Movement science shows us that we move like gods, but behavioral science teaches us that we behave like scoundrels because your behavior is normative. If a chimp goes to pick up a banana, well, no, I don't. I'm not going to put myself in the head of a chimpanzee. Movement science does not is not done in a way that looks at success or failure, achieving goals or not achieving goals. It looks, what are the relative dependencies, interdependencies of the parts that give rise to the overall movement? So the contrast between movement science and behavior science is very similar to what I talked about earlier about the different ways cognition is used. If it's used in a constructive sense, how do we solve problems? Then you're talking about how do we launch, how do we score goals? How do we launch products? There's nothing wrong with having goals. I assure you, I'm not trying to down that, but I'm trying to draw a distinction. There's another sense of cognition, which is more closely related to what's it like to be a dancer? What are the ecstasies of a yogi? Those are important questions too, but they won't be explained to you by anyone.
And how does that map onto the coordination versus control dynamic, or are we in a tangent at this point?
No, control is best illustrated by the delusion of a puppeteer that they're in charge of the puppet stance. Every real puppeteer knows you actually have to work with the properties of the puppet, because the puppet has its own view on things, and the puppet is a wonky piece of stuff that doesn't always do what you want it to. But the idea of a single line of direction from intention to action is built into our very Protestant robotic-like way of viewing ourselves, and it leads to the notion of motor control as a term used, for example. The ghastly term. Coordination does not traffic in that. The idea of control, you control the behavior. You control the behavior to make sure that the goal is met. The control in a heat-seeking missile, for example, succeeds when someone dies. Control is concerned with reaching the goal. We have no license to project that retrospectively onto our bodies and understand ourselves in that fashion. We are not of that fashion. That's the other meaning of cognition, you see? I'm trying to be careful. I hope I'm not trying to disparaging any work, but rather to sort of make clear how many issues are at stake and how many underlying sensibilities and sensitivities we actually have when we ask into such things.
I feel bad for any of my Protestant audience. They this is the second time we're talking about cognitive science, and Protestantism seems to get the brunt of the ire. But
I should justify that, because I don't mean any real Protestants. You must understand, I'm from Ireland. I was born into a theocracy, a Catholic theocracy, and it's left me with a febrile imagination. I have a totally febrile... Look, I've got my rosary beads here. I'm a totally febrile Catholic. Protestantism and the Reformation are typically associated with a form of discarding of superstition, of literalism, and very much with the construction of a person who's autonomous and who bears full responsibility for their actions. Now, those are theological issues. I certainly don't mean to impose on anyone.
I think it is important, and I didn't mean to to clap back there. I've noticed it's interesting that when talking about entangled, embodied, and maybe we'll come back to 4E in other episodes. I'm not sure we've got room now to reintroduce it from the beginning. But when we talk about entangled dynamic systems made up of humans and their interrelations with all the other stuff, we come up against the limits of some of our cultural assumptions about what a human is. And it's worth recognizing that a lot of those cultural assumptions are based in whether you are Jewish like me or Catholic like you or whatever, we have certain Protestant assumptions about things that interweave into our lives in different ways. And it's reasonable to think, from my perspective, they'll come out in our workplaces. We have certain bits of Protestant theology, the way you just described that there, an individual taking responsibility for their work in a very literalist way. And we don't want any of this, and maybe now's the time to get into woo versus science. We don't want any of this woo spiritual stuff, or it jars against us. Well, that's because we have some of the vestiges left over of being a very largely, in the UK at least, Protestant country for a long time. So where do you want to go from there?
Which was anything other than rational, which did not feature autonomous rational agents adhering to a literal truth. The religious development, England went batshit crazy around the time of Protestantism. They had big religious wars, and there was all kinds of people jumping up and shouting and throwing off their clothes and saying, historically, that's not what I meant by Protestantism. I was using it in the sense of an autonomous, self-contained entity. History is a really messy place. It's very interesting. I didn't realize that you are Jewish. When I said I'm Catholic, I'm referring to basically the ground in which my imagination was seeded. And that includes a lot of Jewish images and Protestant images. And these days, I try to feed my imagination much more. Hindu and Buddhist and all kinds of stuff is going in there. And it all works together very well. We're imaginative beings. And I like to think of the brain as an organ of the imagination.
And it's interesting to hear a cognitive scientist talking about imagination and talking about being inspired by different religious images and things like that. And that might contrast with people who are used to hearing Dawkins or Sam Harris or the so-called rationalists who, as a scientist, you are an atheist and you believe that science explains all of the mechanisms of the world, and there's nothing left for this God thing. So it's interesting to hear, and you're not the only cognitive scientist that I think that I've come across that is curious or incorporates some of this stuff in some meaningful way.
What you just outlined is a religion of science. This atheistic thing is a religion of science, and I object to it very strongly. I'm not the only one who does. Let me just point you to a book, which I don't know if you've encountered. Forgot I was wearing headphones. Don't do that. I don't know if you've encountered this book. It's called The Blind Spot.
Nope.
You will know Evan Thompson from The Embodied Mind. The Embodied Mind was very, very important, and Evan Thompson's work has been absolutely groundbreaking. But in this book, he gets together with two physicists, theoretical physicists, to address this question of the religion of science. They don't put it in those terms, but they confront the foundational discipline of theoretical physics with the reality of lived experience, pointing out that the kind of science Dawkins and so on rely on has a very important blind spot. It's blind to the origin of all distinctions that the physicists make in lived experience, in the durée, in this constant unfolding that we're having right now. Fantastic book, and I've been doing videos responding to that as well. I think we'll see more informed talk about this. You see, the word religion is terribly political. It's got mixed up in all kinds of things. But that atheistic approach to science is, for me, the greatest religious dogmatism that prevails at present. I grew up in a theocracy, and I'm not keen on joining a new one based on science.
It's based on some sort of coarse interpretation of what science, based on some sort of quite dry and miserable interpretation of what science can be. Because when I think about the ways in which stories and metaphor and song, and maybe this is a good time to get into joint speech and ritual, these things are part of our human development and for a reason, and we wield symbols just like just like a monkey can wield a stick in a useful way and crack open a nut with it or something. And these things have utility and meaning and a part of our experience, and just imagining that they are superstitions that we should let go of misses a big part of what it means to be a human. And also, going back to the vision stuff, part of my understanding of it is that all of our vision, all of our sense making in the world is constructed in some slightly metaphorical, not quite in contact with the actual thing sort of way. So there's a spectrum of metaphor, from wild metaphors and wild symbols and your astrology and your things like that are really go up in the air, versus like the most concrete kind of metaphor making, which is, I don't know, like sensing the world. Even that's a kind of metaphor, and even that's a kind of abstraction.
Metaphor seems to be fundamental to how we communicate and how we think and the way that language works. People differ here. The degree to which they think that any talk is non-metaphorical varies greatly, and usually when we are in a well-grounded, literalist, objectivist, no problems discourse, if we inquire into it in any way, we'll find that no, we are actually relying on certain metaphors. There's certain structuring conditions that allow us to think like this, which is very handy here. But if you look too hard, you'll find out, oh, I see, we were treating this as if it were much simpler than it is.
What is joint speech? How did you get into studying joint speech?
Two different questions. Joint speech is when multiple people make the same sounds at the same time. That's empirical. We could go out there, we could go for a walk together, and we could find examples of that. That's very unusual in cognitive science. I don't know if you're going to be able to go for a walk and find a schema or a long-term memory, but you can go for a walk and find joint speech. And it was languishing. There was no scientific treatment of joint speech. I came to it through a route which is its own story, which I don't think I'll bother you with. But I came to it as a linguist and a cognitive scientist, and the more I looked at it, the stranger I thought it was that this wasn't the center of linguistics, the starting point of linguistics, rather than a neglected niche cultural phenomenon. Because such practices of speaking the same words at the same time underlie all ritual activity, protest, the kind of temporary alliances we find at the sporting grounds, and the manner in which we instill sacred values into our children. They're found in all cultures, although in different form at each time, and they defy any application of the the usual manner in which we talk about language. So there's no speakers versus listeners, no messages being passed around, no information processing, no fixed individuals. There's temporary collectives who enact something, and that which is enacted may recur next week and the following week, or it may not. It may die away. Sometimes these now we've been led into ritual. Now we've been led into these world-forming practices, and we're asking about their historical stability. Sacrament of the Eucharist, 2,000 years old. Some of this is pretty damn stable, more stable than your computer metaphor. But it introduces all kinds of puzzles, which the dominant view of the person can't address. That's why my work the more I got into joint speech, the more I started abandoning fixed models of the person and realizing that there's great space there for understanding living, collective living, enacting of a world and inhabitation of a body differently. So I'm still having fun with this. One thing I have discovered is that if you can deal with the conceptual difficulties, there's an Aladdin's cave in here through simple study of the empirical activities in which joint speech occurs. Because the speaking itself, I'm not looking at that. I'm looking at where does it happen, when does it happen, why is it happening, when will it happen again, what are the motivations. It's one of the 4 E's is embedded. It's the embedding I'm looking at, always with joint speech. And you find wonderful things there, astonishing things that large in your mind, but don't leave you comfortable with the simplistic descriptions of a closed, fixed, finalized individual trapped by their autobiography on day number. It's only 327 days till you die, Daniel. Hey! We tell ourselves these tragic stories that see us as part of, we miss out partly on how much we participate in the bringing forth of the world through our joint activities, through nobody creates a world on their own. Everything is created together in some sense. So that's been joint speech. It's been absolutely wonderful.
What are some of the gems that you wish more people knew about this world or this area of study?
A I'll give you a little one. Because we're kind of naive but very empirical, we noted that, well, one domain that we think we know about where joint speech crops up is primary education. And okay, let's have a look at that. Now, primary education is a social construct, and the government could decide tomorrow that they should teach the syllabus differently, and the board of Kansas and the board in Dulwich are never going to agree on what should be on the syllabus. So primary education is mainly considered in the sociological register. But it's curious to me that mathematics is taught through chanting. Now, it's not real mathematics. Mathematics is something completely different to what we're doing there. But in every Western-style school, children chant their tables because this is a sacred value of their surrounding community. And if we're clever enough to say, hang on, primary education goes on beyond this scientific hub, and we examine the madrasas, we find there's chanting there too, in which Quranic chanting is the sacred value. And Quranic chanting is instilled at this early age. And exactly like, and parallel with the mathematics case, the sacred values are being instilled, and what's required is that the children say the right words, not that they have the blessed clue what was spoken. The meaning, elucidation, interrogation of the text, no, that's not what's going on. The Quran is, of course, God's speech. What's required is that it's spoken. Interestingly, the sacred value around here of mathematics finds its manifestation in forcing children to chant their times tables, which I assure you is not mathematics, but it's a clear marker of the sacred values in which primary education arises. So that's one interesting thing that you can find looking around like this.
Yeah, it reminds me of like one of the things I both like and don't like about going to synagogue is the experience of being there, chanting a load of texts where people may or may not know what they mean, and you're just sort of like often mumbling along. And there's a lot of people who don't enjoy that, they find it alienating. But there's also something including within that, which is like we're all going to mumble, we're all going to do it together. None of us know what it means completely, or none of us like thinking about the imagery brought up in the Psalms. We're just doing this thing together, and that is valuable and marking in and of itself.
Yeah, but the literal meaning of the text is the wrong way to approach any such activities, right? As you say, if you start asking about the literal meaning of Maccabees or Deuteronomy, you're getting into really weird territory. Daniel, can I ask you a question, because I have you here? You can edit this bit out. And because I do draw such major cross-cultural comparisons, I find some startling things, and I held up these little rosary beads. Now, they're associated with Catholic Ireland. But you find such beads in Buddhism, in Hinduism, in Sikhism. You find them in nearly all the major religious traditions except Judaism. And I've wondered why Jews don't have these. I mean, you've got tefillim, you've got all kinds of ritual I think it might be part of saying we're different to not have the beads, because it really stands out in a cross-cultural perspective that Judaism has resisted the beads. Not that they resist chanting. I mean, I don't know if you went to synagogue school and learned you did a little pointer and chanting the Torah. You know, there's great chanting in Judaism. It's not like repetitious prayers are unknown. It's just odd that the material support is missing. Do you know anything about that?
Yeah, like, as far as I'm aware, and I'm very happy to be corrected, I don't know any reference to any kind of bead in any kind of Jewish practice anywhere.
Yeah, no, me neither.
Yeah, and I don't know. It's not like it's not like someone at one point asked, should we take on these beads, and they thought, nah. It just never seems to have occurred. So I wonder a couple of again, complete speculations. One is we have something that is like similar to a bead, which is the tzitzit, which are the like tassels on the corners of prayer shawls. Like you might see Orthodox male Jews
fingering the tassels.
Yeah, or like they have these like white strings that dangle from them, and like during the prayer services you like play with them, and it's not like part of it, or there are some chants where you are supposed to hold them up, and so there is like that thing to hold, at least for men, which opens up a whole other rabbit hole of like what are the women supposed to be playing with, but we will avoid that one for this particular podcast. But so maybe that took the role, so it wasn't needed, but otherwise or yeah, maybe there's a separateness thing in like being generally a minority culture. We didn't want to take on the vestiges of the surrounding religions.
There's an Egyptologist called Jan Assmann who has written very cogently about from an Egyptian perspective about this story about the Jewish exile, which is largely there's not much of a history of Jewish exile from Egypt actually, but there's a great deal of mythology around this. And some of that mythology comes out as what he calls a counter-religion. That is, the Egyptians vilified the Jews and the Jews vilified the Egyptians. So if you wear blue, we're wearing red. If you put on pants, we're taking them off. And they sort of separated in this way. And maybe there's something to that. I mean, we're dealing with material artifacts, material supportive practices, and they're definitely non-sectarian. So the beads are not, like these are Catholic beads, but they're bead twiddling is not a sectarian activity. There's different beads, different numbers, usually 108. The Catholics use 10 at a time. But anyway, I just thought I'd ask that. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a fair question. There's always things to twiddle. Like you see, like the Hasidic Jews will like twiddle their side curls while they're studying or
yes.
while they're praying.
Oh well, the hands are always doing things anyway, aren't they? These kind of make sense.
It does make sense, especially like as a like slightly sort of ADHD person. The idea of having something to fiddle with that is like sanctioned is actually kind of handy.
Yeah, those spinners people used to use, the spinners.
Yeah,
they were very popular.
What is the Jewish approach to fidget spinning? Is a great question.
Yeah, fidget spinning. They're secular rosary beads, possibly. I don't know.
But yeah, we get these pens that have all sorts of different things to fiddle on.
Oh yeah, no. Some people are born pen twiddlers. Yeah.
I will ask if there's any one more point or one more spark that you haven't had a moment to introduce into this conversation before we draw to its close.
I don't really, except to say that thank you very much. We've ranged over a great deal of issues, and I find it wonderful to talk to people, and it's very nice to lay things out. And some of what we said won't be of relevance to lots of people. But we reached that word explain, and I sort of reacted badly to the word explain. If I go to IKEA and I get a flat pack, I want someone to explain to me how to put the flat pack together, because then the damn thing will be assembled, and that was good explanation. I would like to see more of a spirit of finitude, humility, epistemic humility, and a willingness to be ignorant in the sciences generally, in living generally, and to recognize that cognitive science is encouraging us to recognize that we don't have complete understanding, outside understanding, that we missed one of the E's, enacting a world together, bringing the world into being by doing, without any strong division into individuals and collectives. I would be happy if people associated the word cognitive science with that kind of epistemic sensitivity and humility, rather than with, we're going to explain how things work.
So if people leave this episode with a sense of, if I'm looking at something from a cognitive science lens, I'm interested in what's happening when an action takes place or how a problem is being solved, but without trying to get to an explanation of this is what it's about.
Well, you used an interesting optical metaphor. You said we're looking at cognitive science through a cognitive science lens. This is my cognitive. There's no cognitive science lens. The idea that you can get a clear view of how things are without interference and without your own participation is precisely the idealism that I'm trying to push back against a little bit. I don't know. You do cognitive science with everything. I do anyway.
That feels like a great place to draw it to an end. Professor Fred Cummins, thank you for appearing on Agile on the Mind.
Daniel, thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you.